What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Ever since the existence of Hearthstone, there's always been kind of like these jokes about it kind of being like a no-skill game. All you gotta do is play minions and go face. Sure, there's some decks that might be like that, but there's definitely going to be some decks that are harder to play than others. So in today's video, we're counting down our top 5 hardest decks to play in Hearthstone that still exist in some relevant form today. And if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button and let's begin. So first up at number 5, we have Zoo Warlock. Now a lot of you guys might be thinking, what the hell? Zoo's an aggro deck. All you gotta do is play minions and go face, but in truth, Zoo's actually a lot more difficult to play extremely well at the absolute perfect level than you might think. There's a reason why a lot of pro players like Muzzy, like Zixo, can reach super high legend every season with Zoo, while other players are kind of stuck at rank 10 with the exact same deck list. And that difference definitely is not luck. First of all, you have access to life tap, which makes pretty much any deck a lot harder to play and just navigate in general. Your hero power drawing you a card means that you generally just have more cards in your hand than you would without it, which means you also, as a result, have a lot more choices to make. And min-maxing everything from when you play minions, when you use your hero power, when you decide to play around board clears or other certain cards, and really just drawing the line between like the slightly higher tempo play or maybe taking the extra card, or there's a lot of lines of play that are actually especially hard to play with in Zoo. You can't really run out of gas, but you also can't commit too much to the board. There's a lot of decisions and risks that you do have to make that you probably wouldn't appreciate if you're just starting or if you're just playing against the deck. Minion positioning as well is a big factor that can matter a lot in Zoo and is something that you never really see take place or actually have any relevance in other decks as well. You've got cards like Defender of Argus and Direwolf Alpha that can really impact the board states depending on where you place your minions. And you have to think very carefully about every decision, how to attack. The difference I guess with Zoo that potentially makes it look like it's a little bit easier to play than it is because I would argue that maybe Zoo Warlock gets punished a little bit less for the mistakes that it makes, but at the same time we're kind of looking at this list of just how hard is the deck to play at the absolute perfect level. And although Zoo is a curve based kind of aggro deck, every point throughout your entire curve is going to come with countless decision and a ton of potential for you to make mistakes, and a very skilled Zoo player is going to beat a less skilled Zoo player so consistently, which only really goes to show that Zoo is potentially one of the most skill testing decks in the game. Next up, we're taking a look at Handlock, although it kind of includes Renolock and Combo Lock, like slow Warlock decks, since the playstyle is very similar. Once again, when you're playing the Warlock class, you really get put up with a lot of decisions, even more so than Zoo really, and in the slower Warlock decks you get punished for your mistakes a lot more as well, especially as far as choices from playing cards from your hand go. I mean, it's not uncommon to have up to 10 cards in your hand really when playing Handlock. It is called Handlock for a reason after all, and there's also a lot of min-maxing of just making sure you're not overdrawing and all sorts of like mind games and additional mental steps that you have to take to play the deck perfectly. Additionally, a lot of Handlock variants are going to put you on just the absolute brink of just so close to death, and you really tout that line of just getting so close to dying and then having to come back and stabilize on the board, or really just min-maxing to see how greedy you can really get away with playing, or holding out and knowing when to play your heal cards or your Reno Jackson, all sorts of stuff. And Handlock players that aren't really experienced with the deck are going to misplay constantly and are also going to lose very frequently to burn damage as well. Overall though, I mean, the wealth of just options and especially risks that you have to take with your life total when you play Handlock and all of the other slow Warlock variants is really what makes those decks some of the most difficult to play in the entire game. Moving on, we have Control Warrior, which is a deck that's been pretty hard to play well and really so much harder to just play absolutely perfectly. And again, we kind of have the stark contrast of people trying to figure out this deck for the first time, dropping loads of ranks, and then at the same time you've got pro players like Fibonacci who hit high legend every season playing Control Warrior by itself. So Control Warrior is pretty much as late game of a deck as you could really get, so you're going to be fatiguing a ton, and advancing there at a pretty slow pace as well, unlike a mill deck or something kind of wonky like that, which means that you get to make a ton of decisions over the course of the game, and the games last so long and you have so much time for just decisions in general, and so your actual skill is going to make such a bigger impact than in a deck that wins or loses in 7 or 8 turns. And there's also so much more to it. Control Warrior has access to all sorts of removal spells, and when you have them in your hand, it's really important to decide, can I afford to play this card? Do I need to save it for something else? What do you do if a certain card is the best option in the current board state, but maybe it's your last remaining removal spell and your opponent's playing a deck that can like flood the board really easily or something like that. Do you use this card at this time? You know, do you want to use your revenge to kill 2 things, or maybe a fiery war axe and afford to let your opponent's minion live? All sorts of like crazy control plays, and pretty much every turn in Control Warrior is going to have one of those really incredible difficult decisions, and it's just such a hard deck to play in terms of like when you play your cards and when you don't play your cards especially. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that in a lot of matches you're just never going to be able to win through fatigue, and you have to really carefully put together this Alexstrasza Grom burst combo while also still defending yourself from threats and making sure you don't die, which is especially hard since it's just such a hard combo to pull off. Next up at number 2 on the list, we have Miracle Rogue, and oh man, this deck definitely speaks for itself. I mean, a typical Miracle Rogue game can consist of losing on board for 10 straight turns, and then you just cast 12 spells in a single turn and win the game. You know, both surviving and comboing off with your spells are very difficult with Miracle Rogue, and especially there's so little room for mistakes. Once you develop that Gadgetzan Auctioneer, you start casting spells, you cycle your deck, you're going to have very little time to think in between seeing the animations and just the time that your turn really takes. There's also so much micromanagement and especially early game resource management that needs to be done with optimizing your cards, your hero power, your combos, not to mention also having to decide when to combo off with your Auctioneer, when to try to set it for the kill. You know, there's a period of time where just some amazing Miracle Rogue players were so unbeatable, and yet despite the power of the deck in history, it's always had a horrible win percentage across ladder across the board because it's just so hard to play for people that aren't used to playing the deck. Capping out the list, and in our opinion, the hardest deck to play in Hearthstone, it's Freeze Mage. We've already talked about how drawing cards, having more options, and all sorts of stuff makes things harder, and although Freeze Mage doesn't necessarily have life tap, it certainly does draw a gigantic amount of cards, but really that's the least of your worries when you're playing Freeze Mage. I mean, it's such an interesting deck that's really one of the only decks where your win conditions also double as like removal spells and tools that you use to make it so that your opponent can't kill you. I mean, every Fireball, Frostbolt, Forgotten Torch, every spell can just either go face or you can hit a minion, and managing the two and knowing when you can afford to use spells on minions is extremely difficult. And of course you also have a little bit of supplementary removal like Doomsayers, but you still have to make so many decisions about where to send your burn spells, and planning ahead is just so important in Freeze Mage. Oftentimes you have to plan 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes 10 turns ahead to actually be able to win the game, which is incredibly difficult. There's so much hidden information, like what cards your opponent has in his deck, his or her deck, and what you're both being able to draw in the next few turns. And as well, Freeze Mage is not a deck that can just stall forever and then win in one turn. You do eventually run out of stall tools, and you also have to slowly set up your Alexstrasza combo, accumulate burn spells while also desperately fighting to not have your ice block procced so that it can be up when you play Alexstrasza. Freeze Mage also runs into the difficulty that Control Warrior also shares, which is really just when to use your removal, how much you can afford to use it, and when you can afford to let things live. You know, you only have so many Frost Novas, so many Doomsayers, so much removal, and if you think you're going to need them later, or that if your opponent maybe has some way to play around it, maybe to kill your Doomsayer, you have so many things that you have to account for, and there's a reason why people new to Freeze Mage pretty much just never win with the deck, while those that have played Freeze Mage for years are just incredibly difficult to beat, and the deck has such a high skill cap, and as a result takes the #1 spot as the most difficult deck to play in Hearthstone. So what do you guys think about our list? Definitely let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you want, and I'll see you guys next time.